All right, kids. Today, all you're really going to need is your notebook. Today, we are going to get started on our Age of Imperialism PowerPoint. You kind of read some of the stuff that we're going to go over here at the beginning, some of the motivations of imperialism during the 1800s and early 1900s. Hopefully, though, we'll get far enough today where we can actually go over some specific examples of where all of this stuff is. Again, all you really need is your notebook, so please get that out. You will need some notes over this PowerPoint for your second notebook check in the 6 weeks, which is coming up here soon. A couple announcements. Most of these I made yesterday, but still, I know it's kind of redundant, but I like to definitely hammer some things home every day. First and foremost, new announcement, essay grades are in. If you turned in on time there, if you turned in like last night after school or something, I haven't checked those yet. Extra credit, if you did the extra credit quiz on AP Classroom, that's been added as well. So your grade should be up to date. If you want some feedback on your essay, because Canvas, for whatever reason, you can't see the little comments I make, just let me know. Shoot me an email. I'll send you the breakdown and kind of type up a little summary of some of the things you did well, some of the things that you could improve on. But yeah, just let me know if you want that, and we'll get that done. AP exam money, got to say this every day for the next week or so. That is due next Friday, the 19th. You probably still owe that second installment. If you have questions about what you owe, please talk to Ms. Cordova in the counseling office. And remember, you make all your payments online through total registration. We're doing Age of Imperialism for the rest of the week, probably the very beginning of next week as well. We're going to close it out next week, hopefully on Tuesday, with an SAQ over this information, as well as what you read yesterday. That'll be one of your last daily grades. If all goes according to plan, we will have our Unit 5 and 6 DCA 1750 to 1900 next Thursday. And then on Friday, you've got your second notebook check, and if you would like to do it, that extra credit documentary review essay. So lots of stuff coming up, but essentially after next week, I'm hoping to kind of wrap up grades for the 6 weeks next week and kind of get started on some new stuff afterwards. So if you have any questions, by all means, let me know. Today we'll get into the PowerPoint and hopefully take some pretty decent notes. So Age of Imperialism. I don't know why that's faded. Maybe there we go. And we're mainly talking 1850 to 1914. Again, this is kind of a new age of imperialism. We've talked about imperialism as a concept really all year long, but this is a time period in which, well, this is going on a lot, especially amongst those industrialized countries. So let me ask you this. First question. This is something you should all know because, man, we defined this yesterday. Who can tell me what imperialism is? In the simplest terms, what is that? Imperialism. It should be in your notes from yesterday. Probably one of the first things that you wrote. You don't have to give me the whole definition. But what word do you think of, Mr. Hernandez?
Control the government and economy.
Yeah, it's empire building. That's all it is. It is a new phase of empire building. A lot of different groups are involved in this. The British would probably be the biggest. Again, a lot of this is tied to industrialization. A lot of the reasons that, these countries, these industrialized nations are going out and building empires is to kind of fuel the needs of industry back home. So it kind of makes sense. The British, who were the first nation to industrialize, remember the Industrial Revolution started there, it would make sense that they'd probably participate the most. Have you guys ever heard of the British Empire? I mean, we used to be a part of it once upon a time. Guys, the British Empire, this is worth writing down, largest empire in human history, by far. Now, the Mongols are the largest land-based empire. Okay, they had one contiguous empire that spanned most of Asia, some of Europe. But the British, well, they have a maritime empire. They may be, centrally located on a small island, but they've got land holdings really all over the world. It's one of the reasons that English is such a common language. It's because the British have conquered and colonized areas on just about every continent, just about anywhere you could think of. So that's what we're talking about today. It's not just the British, but the British are definitely the ones that are into it the most. This lasts, really all the way through 1914. That is when World War I breaks out, after all. This whole process is certainly a contributing factor to that. So just a reminder, and you should have gotten this yesterday, but for some reason you didn't, basic definitions. Imperialism, the practice of one country controlling the government and economy of another country or territory. Easiest way to think of it, just empire building. The word itself, imperialism, spelt differently, but empire is there. Part of imperialism oftentimes is colonialism, the system by which a country maintains colonies outside its borders. Now, in some of these situations, you're going to see kind of what they did overseas in the Americas, what we refer to as settler colonies, where they actually send a lot of their own people to live over there and kind of work in the colonies. But what we're also going to see is a lot more informal control, where oftentimes people like the British will keep locals in power that will kind of rule in their name. It's a way of indirectly governing over places, sometimes outright colonizing, sometimes not. The point is that a small group of countries during this time period is going to control almost the entirety of the rest of the world. And when you think about, how the world is today, the countries that we see they're very wealthy and powerful, and the countries that seem to be underdeveloped and seem to struggle, guys, this is kind of the roadmap of how we get to where we are. The 1800s and early 1900s, guys, that was not that long ago. So hopefully you'll start to see a lot of the connections that we still have today. So let's introduce the age of imperialism, and then I've got some questions for you based on what you read yesterday. And if you did your reading, a lot of this is going to sound familiar. A lot of this is ripped directly out of the AMSCO book. So, hopefully it'll be a good review. Lastly, things that I highlight, and I usually do this in my PowerPoints, they're worth writing down. Not saying you have to write down all of it, not saying it has to be word for word, but I do try to point out certain things that I think will be valuable later on as far as SAQs and tests and things of that nature. We got an SAQ and a test next week, so, these are some of the things that are probably going to be on there, so take a decent amount of notes, please. From 1850 to 1914, many world nations engaged in the process of empire building that would encompass nearly 80% of the Earth's surface. Just let that roll around your head for a second. We'll go over the countries. You'll see the map. You'll know who all's involved. But there are a very small number of countries, mostly the industrial powers, that end up controlling almost the entirety of our planet. Like I said, 80% of the Earth's surface was touched by imperialism during this age in some way, shape, or form, either directly or indirectly. That is staggering. It is very staggering to think that these few can rule over so many. But when you see the names, you'll realize, well, these are still many of the wealthy and powerful nations to this day. Not all of them. Some things have changed. But again, there's reasons why things are the way they are. History's your answer. Western European countries, such as Great Britain, France, and Germany, primarily targeted lands in Asia and Africa while strengthening their grip on lands already under their control. The British already had some colonies at this point, like in Australia. The French had some territory still, but you're going to see a broadening of all these empires. Africa gets conquered and colonized almost in its entirety and will remain so in a lot of ways until after World War II. Asia, you do see India get taken over. You do see parts of Southeast Asia get directly colonized, places like Vietnam, Indonesia. China, we kind of already talked about that. While they don't get directly colonized, they certainly are manipulated and controlled to some extent, economically, if nothing else. But the United States is involved in both as well. I mean, up to this point in history, we haven't talked about the U.S. a whole lot. Last we really talked about them is the American Revolution. You know, we rebel against, what do you know, the British. We establish a nation of our own. Well, in those early years, I mean, we're still a growing power. You know, we're not, you know, even in the 1800s, this dominant world power that we are today, arguably the most powerful and wealthy nation in the world, arguably, maybe not wealthy, but most powerful. We're not that at this point, you know, at this point in the 1800s. We're growing into that very slowly. But the America that you guys think of, that's not a thing until really after World War II. Up to that point, we're just we're growing in power and influence, but we're not quite to the level of some of these older, more established countries. Empire building is one of the ways that we get there. The United States, you know, we don't really focus on Africa and Asia as much, but we do indirectly exert a lot of influence in Latin America and the Caribbean, and we do directly colonize some areas in the Pacific. I mean, that's how we get Hawaii, amongst other island nations that are so far away. Russia continues doing what Russia does. They're not so much like colonizing lands overseas, but they are continuing to spread their influence more or less to what they become to this day, all the way to the east, to the ends of Asia. And then you got Japan. Last we talked about Japan, you know, up until the mid 1800s, I mean, they're still living like they were in the Middle Ages, essentially. They had had some contact with the outside world. They had seen some things like firearms and whatnot, but they had purposely isolated themselves, wanted to kind of retain their traditional values. Mid 1800s, you know, because of the United States, they opened their doors, and the state kind of reorganizes their government. They get rid of the shogun. They put the emperor back in charge, at least theoretically, as a figurehead. That's the Meiji Restoration. And they start a very rapid series of industrialization projects and modernization projects themselves. Well, part of industrialization, unfortunately, during this time period goes hand in hand with imperialism. So they're doing some empire building in their own right, just different areas, mainly in East Asia and the Pacific. Why did they do it? That's what you read about yesterday. Imperialism was justified by these nations through economic, political, and ideological motivations. And that is what we're going to talk about next. So I want you to look back at your notes from yesterday. Yesterday, you were supposed to read a few pages from chapter 24 of the AMSCO book. Those notes are kind of their own thing in your notebook check next week. But you were supposed to kind of summarize some of the things that would fall into these categories, you know, different reasons why nations were empire building. Some of them were related to economics, you know, making money, that's obvious. Some of them were related to politics. Some of them, and the most evil of them, were related to ideas. So who can tell me one thing that you got? One sort of motivation. You can pick any of these, but what's something that stood out that helped to explain why these European and other nations were out there empire building, maybe how they're doing? Come on, look at those notes. Yes, ma'am. Okay, raw materials. Perfect answer. Fantastic. We kind of talked about that when we did our Industrial Revolution PowerPoint and all that. You know, these industrialized nations, we'll just use the British as an example because they were the biggest one. You know, they've got these factories and they're producing all these goods. Well, they need raw materials. They need access to raw materials. And having colonies or having territories under their control overseas was a real easy and cheap way to get those things, to get the cotton, to get the rubber, to get the meat, to get anything else that they needed. Because, you know, Great Britain itself, I mean, they've got some stuff. They've got coal and they've got iron, you know, some of the things that contributed to industrialization starting there. But as far as like forests and things like that, relatively bare. So for them, in their mind, hey, we want to make more money. We want to be bigger and richer and more powerful. We need cheaper access, more direct access to raw materials. That just kind of makes sense. Okay, what else? Right here.
The rise of nationalism and creation of nation state.
Nationalism. Good job. Never goes away. Still around to some extent. But man, during the 1800s and early 1900s, nationalism is a huge force. You've got some people that want countries of their own, but in these established countries, I mean, having an empire, I mean, that's a way to really pronounce yourself to the world as this great and powerful nation. I mean, that's definitely a political motivation, you know, and especially in Europe, pretty small continent, you've got all these countries that are very competitive with each other. They more or less had always been, at least since the age of exploration. So as the British get more land, well, the French are going to want more land, and it's just this never-ending cycle that definitely, you know, causes a lot of problems throughout history. Give me one or two more things, just a couple things to introduce. We're going to go over this stuff. Let me push you in the right direction. We've got an economic motivation. We've got a political motivation. What about ideas? Now, this is the really dark, twisted, evil, messed up stuff. But that's history. History is, unfortunately, it can be beautiful. There's a lot of great things that we talk about, but we can't ignore the bad things. Right here.
Climate
A lot of racist attitudes. A lot of people, especially in Europe, not everybody, obviously, it's just like today. Some people have some deranged ideas, some people don't. But some people, some very powerful people were claiming that, hey, you know, industrialization, you know, started here in Europe. And that must mean that we as white Western Europeans have some sort of natural superiority to those that are non-white, those from different regions. Those sort of racist ideas started to manifest themselves. Whether they truly believed them or not doesn't really matter. I mean, who knows? They were an excuse. If they could paint people in Africa and Asia and Latin America and the Pacific as in some way naturally less than them, in need of, you know, the racially superior Europeans to come and rule over them, to protect them and all this nonsense, they could justify it then. They could say, well, of course we should be doing this. Ultimately, we're going to go there and take over, but ultimately because these people are not capable of achieving as much as us, we can maybe help them and help rise them up. Again, it's a bunch of crap. It's all based on racism and greed, but that is certainly a justification that people were talking about at the time. Again, racism obviously has not went away, but you got to think back then, it was so much more overt. It was socially acceptable. So, you know, people in power, like I said, mainly in Europe, but you could look at the United States, you could look elsewhere. They weren't afraid of using some of these really messed up ideas that today we would just, you know, really shun to justify what they were doing. Good job. There's some more, but we at least got the ball rolling. It's all about money and power and excuses, honestly. Excuses to take things that are not theirs. Now, I've shown you this map before, but just look at it. You've got a small number of countries here on the left. You got the British, the French, the Russians, the Spanish, the Netherlands, aka the Dutch, Belgium, Portugal, Italy, Germany, the Ottomans, the United States. They're the main empires of this time. Now, in our previous little age of imperialism, I guess you could say, the Spanish and the Portuguese were big time players. They're not doing a whole lot at this point. The areas that they have under their control, it's pretty much just the stuff that was left over from the earlier age of empire building. The Dutch, kind of sorted to the same extent. It's not like they're going out and getting a whole lot of new stuff, but the colonies that they did develop, especially in Indonesia, they still control. The Russians are doing their empire building, but again, it's a little bit separate from these guys because it's not so much about industrialization, although to some extent it is, but they're pretty much just staying in their connected territory. And then the Ottomans, they still got an empire, but it's, as we've said, kind of on the decline. Just look at all those colors. You see some areas that are completely whited out. China's whited out, but we know they were kind of getting taken over to some extent. Latin America, most of it's whited out, but as you'll see, the United States was exerting a lot of influence in these days. And while they never directly like colonized a lot of these places, well, not all of them. I mean, we got Puerto Rico and whatnot, but they are definitely exerting a lot of economic influence. I mean, we're looking at that almost everywhere. Almost everywhere was touched by this in some way, shape, or form. Africa is probably the most clear example, as you see European countries go in there and almost gobble the whole thing up. But really, we could say almost all over the world. I mean, empire building was part of their history. Again, messed up time in history. Look at all that British territory, though, in the pink. That's why they're the largest empire in world history. There's this old saying, and it might be worth writing down. You may have heard it. It says the sun never sets on the British Empire. The sun never sets on the British Empire. And the idea is, they had colonies or territories under their influence everywhere. So literally, you look worldwide, the sun would never set on some area that they were in control of. That is pretty staggering. Today, you don't so much see that. A lot of these empires kind of broke up, after World War I and World War II. And today, we don't really even use the term empire anymore because it definitely has a negative connotation. But, you can make the argument that these empires, to some extent, still exist. We just don't really call them that. All right, so first we're going to talk about economic motivations. What's in it for these countries from a financial perspective? Due to the Industrial Revolution, industrialized nations required greater access to raw materials for manufacturing. That just kind of makes sense, and that's what we brought up when we discussed things. If you are a country like England or France or whoever, you need access to all these things, petroleum, you might need wood, you may need agricultural products. I mean, the list goes on and on, minerals that you may not actually possess in your territory. For them, it's a lot cheaper rather than having to buy this stuff and maybe people jacking up the prices to go and directly control the supply of your raw materials as well. Again, a lot of this is based on greed. Additionally, new markets were needed to be created to increase the opportunities to sell manufactured goods. These industrialized nations, they need new places to sell their stuff. So if they can go and either directly or indirectly take over lands far and far away, where they're kind of making ready-made trade partners, because in these areas, they're going to have to buy their goods if they're going to buy anything. In some places, like in Africa, man, if you want to manufacture goods, you're getting them from the country that colonized you. In other areas, like China, we saw different areas kind of get carved up into spheres of influence. Either way, going out there and spreading out, part of it was to create those new markets, to have more and more people to sell your stuff to. Because if you can increase the number of people that you're selling your manufactured goods to, obviously that's going to be more profitable. Colonial peoples were often also used as a cheap form of labor as well. Slavery by the mid to late 1800s, like quote unquote chattel slavery, had been made illegal just about everywhere. But it doesn't mean the exploitation wasn't still around. I mean, people like the British saw that they could pay someone in Africa or in Asia less wages than they could for maybe somebody in Europe. So going and taking over a territory, I mean, it's a win-win for these industrialized nations. They have new people to sell their stuff to, they have more access to raw materials, and they can use the people that live there as a cheap form of labor to get those raw materials. Again, this is all about exploitation, and industrialized nations made a lot of money during this time based on this. Instead of serving their own economic interests, colonies were turned into what we call export economies. We kind of talked about this before. The goods they produced were not meant for their domestic use, but sent to colonial powers for profit. A lot of those exports are based on the cultivation of cash crops. Things like tea and cotton and sugar and palm oil, rubber, coffee. These were forced to be produced in mass quantities.
This overuse of land led to monocultures, or a lack of agricultural diversity, with the land quickly being depleted of its fertility. So people like the British go in and they see an area that maybe has an abundance in something like, sugarcane, where they can at least grow sugarcane, or maybe they can grow tea, the tea plant, which you can't grow everywhere. They would basically force the people in those areas to use the majority of their land to produce these particular crops. The problem is, and I'm no expert in agriculture, but when you plant the same crop in the same area season after season, you can rob the soil of its fertility. You can make it to where it's not good farmland anymore. That's why, even in the Middle Ages, people figured out crop rotation. You plant different types of plants in plots of land season after season. Sometimes you let the land grow fallow to where, it can kind of just rest. And that's one of the ways you can keep your land productive. But back then, maybe not, looking at the long-term impact, these colonizing countries, they wanted to make as much money as they could. So they didn't really care what happened to the land in the long term, as long as they were benefiting in the short term. You look at various parts of Africa today, because Africa is one of the main places that this happens to. They are the only continent in the world that cannot grow enough food to feed their population. It's one of the reasons you see certain countries very heavily rely on foreign donations. Some of that goes back to how the land was used during these days, where these cash crops were really the sole focus, and it was at the expense of people growing things that they needed to survive. Again, you look at, Africa, you look at some other areas that are, not all of Africa is like this, but some areas that have struggled over the years, that are impoverished. Again, this is part of the story. This is part of the legacy. With the Industrial Revolution, newspapers become bigger. What we call political cartoons become bigger, because even people that were either illiterate or not as literate, they could kind of see what was going on. And oftentimes in these political cartoons, you're going to see some racist stuff, but you're also going to see caricatures. You're going to see, certain attributes of individuals like exaggerated, like what you'd see at Six Flags when they do like the little portraits. Those are really popular. Look over here to the left. Look at the picture closely. Anybody tell me what you think that represents? Something we studied. Something we studied pretty recently. Any ideas? What's being carved up there? That word, and I don't know what country this comes from, so it's definitely spelled slightly different than what we would spell it as, but what do you think that word's supposed to say? China. So look at what we have. We have what looks like a Chinese gentleman. We talked about how in the Qing Dynasty, oftentimes they had those queues, those ponytails that they wore. That was part of their culture. And then you've got all these foreigners. Now, you may not know who all they are, but what we have here is, I think, Queen Victoria of England. You've got Otto von Bismarck here of Germany with the little pointy helmet. You got, I believe that's one of the czars. That might be Nicholas II there, Russia. You have this young lady here who I'm not really sure exactly who she is, but there is a lady, I don't know the story behind it, but in a lot of French artwork, especially from the Revolution, kind of representing liberty. And then who do you think you have right here kind of stroking his chin with the top knot? It's a neighbor of China. The only Asian country that becomes industrialized. Japan. Very good. They're carving it up. You guys remember when we talked about spheres of influence? Yeah, that's what they're doing. See over here, again, the spelling's different. I don't know what country it comes from, but we'll talk about something called the Berlin Conference in the late 1800s. Here you have Africa being carved up like pieces of a cake. Guys, there's a lot of symbolism here. I mean, think about the things that you carve up. They're things that you consume. They're things that you eat. You carve up a pizza. You carve up a brisket, you know. You carve up things that to you are just, you know, something that you're going to consume, something you're going to eat, something you're going to fill yourself up with. It's not that far from the attitude a lot of these colonizing countries had. They didn't necessarily care about the people there. They didn't care about their rights. They cared about what they could gain. So we've got our economic motives. You know, you got your raw materials, you've got your new markets, you've got cheap labor, you know, things of that nature. Now let's talk about politics. And a lot of it does go back to that force of nationalism. Especially in Western Europe, revolutions, the rise of nationalism, and the creation of new nation states characterized much of the 1800s. Building an empire was one way for a country to compete for power and assert its national identity in the global arena. Nationalism and the competition for colonies created by imperialism would later become underlying causes of World War I, 1914 to 1918. We're going to get to World War I after this, because this is how we get there. And we'll talk about some other stuff like militarism and the alliance system, but you got to understand World War I, even though it's called World War I, it's primarily a European conflict. Most of the main instigators are European. It's called a world war because all those countries also had colonies around the world. So if the mother country was fighting, to some extent, the colonies were either fighting or at least supporting. That's why it becomes a global conflict, even though most of the direct fighting is in Europe and most of the direct combatants are European. Because it all ties to this. Imperialism, you know, that competition for colonies, that competition for resources, the forces of nationalism, wanting to be the biggest, wanting to be the best, kind of pronouncing that to the world. I mean, that's how we get involved in World War I. And to some extent, the same forces lead us to World War II 20 years later. World War II being the most damaging, deadly conflict in all of human history. Again, it didn't happen overnight. Tensions were building for 40, 50, 60 years leading into that. The mid to late 1800s, all into the 1900s, there were little things happening constantly that eventually made warfare essentially inevitable. You look at this little political cartoon, you've got England there at the middle, and you got the guy in his top hat. Maybe he's like a factory owner or a government worker, and man, he's like an octopus. You see arms reaching all over. Canada and Egypt and Malta, and I can't even read some of the stuff that's bigger on your screen, but still, that's the reach of the British Empire. And it's not like people were ambivalent to it at the time. I mean, people knew what was going on. It was the way things were. Imperialism, the process of building an empire, you know, I think we look at it today and it's like, man, that's messed up. But back then, that was kind of seen as what powerful countries did. It was accepted, as it had been accepted for much of human history up to that point. Now, we say a lot about the British, but guys, America is an empire. We've never called ourselves the American Empire, because when you hear empire, you think, oh, those are the bad guys. You've probably all heard victors write the history books. The history we learn about is from the perspectives of the winners. It always is, and it's always been. That's why you got to always question everything that you read, even in these primary source documents. Question everything. That's part of what the CAP process is about. But think about, you know, empires and kind of how you define it. I mean, I think of an empire, I think of a group that grows in power and starts taking over more and more territory and ruling over those territories. Okay? They constantly expand. And they get that territory, sometimes through negotiation, but oftentimes through warfare. Well, look at us, okay? We start off as these 13 colonies of Great Britain, and we rebel and we form a nation of our own. We negotiate and purchase some land. I mean, we bought the Louisiana Purchase from Napoleon. Much later, we purchased what is now Alaska from Russia. But the rest of it, we won through warfare. We fought wars against Mexico. We fought wars against Spain. Some would say we at least attempted genocide of Native Americans, all to achieve that goal of manifest destiny by any means necessary. Later on in this time period, we acquire land in the Pacific. We get Hawaii, we get Guam, we get the Philippines, we get areas in Latin America directly. I mean, that's how we still have Puerto Rico to this day, the U.S. Virgin Islands, you know. This stuff, it didn't happen overnight. Some of it was negotiated. A lot of it was done through warfare. Again, we're an empire, guys. China's an empire. Russia's an empire. Empires are still around. We just don't call them that, because empire over the years has gotten a really bad reputation. Really, ever since World War II. Because why did we fight? To stop Germany and Japan from building empires. Okay, there's more to it than that, but that's essentially kind of what we were doing. And if we're saying they're the bad guys for doing this and we need to defeat them, and obviously they were doing some other atrocious things, but that's not why we fought them. We fought them for the empire thing. If we say that they're the bad guys for doing that, we can't really continue doing that, or at least we can't continue making it obvious what we're doing. But empire, it's never one way. I don't think it ever will. We just don't use the word anymore. But the really messed up motivations are ideological. Now, I'm going to warn you, some of the stuff I'm going to talk about, or I'm going to show you, it's upsetting. It is very racist, evil stuff. But unfortunately, racism, to me, this is all about greed. The racist stuff that we're going to talk about are more excuses than anything. They're justifications that people made up. That way they could feel better about themselves, or they could sell the idea of going and conquer and colonize in foreign lands. They can make it more palatable. But these were not completely unheard of or uncommon beliefs, you know, at the time. And in the historical context of these times, I mean, racism was pretty overt. It was out there. It was open. Today, you know, I like to think things have improved, but you know, a lot of these forces still exist. They're just not as obvious as they once were. So just be forewarned. This is going to be upsetting, but you got to know this stuff. It is part of the story. Proponents of imperialism often shared racist attitudes, looking at non-whites as children who needed to be supervised and taken care of. White racists' condescending attitudes towards, quote unquote, the darker corners of the earth, that's Theodore Roosevelt, were not a reason for imperialism, but a justification for it. Pseudoscientists, which means not really science, almost made up science, strengthened racist justifications for conquest by claiming to have scientific proof of the intellectual and physical inferiority of non-white races. An example of a pseudoscience they talked about in the book, phrenology. Phrenologists were people who studied the shapes and sizes of skulls. They claimed the smaller skull size proved the mental feebleness of Africans, indigenous Americans, and Asians. Legitimate science was also subverted for racist purposes. There were, like I said, pseudoscientists in America, in Europe, that tried to basically justify racism by saying biologically those of white Western European descent were just, they were superior. They were naturally superior. You're going to see other crazy people like Adolf Hitler, you know, espouse a lot of these theories later on. Again, it's crap, but it's made up to you know, make the whole process of doing things that are clearly wrong, going and taking over land that's not yours and killing to get it, things that are clearly wrong. They're using it as a justification. Well, of course we could do this because we are just naturally superior. We're naturally more capable. I mean, look, we're modernized. We have factories. These people don't, obviously. Again, it's nonsense. But, you know, people believe some messed up things, and beliefs compel us to do some messed up things sometimes. Charles Darwin's 19th century theory of evolution by natural selection stated that over the course of millions of years, biological competition had weeded out the weaker species in nature, and that the fittest species were the ones who ultimately survived. Advocates of something called social Darwinism, kind of an offshoot of this theory, used the survival of the fittest theory to justify European and U.S. dominance. They claimed that whites had used their biological superiority to compete victoriously with the other races of the world. Writers and politicians used social Darwinism to justify actions of imperial powers around the world. They called it white man's burden. These are two terms you got to have down because they will come up again. And they're evil and they are wrong, but unfortunately, they were used heavily to justify why people were going into Africa and Asia and Latin America and the Pacific and taking over. Essentially, during this time period, even though for most of human history, Europe is like the most backwards place, they said, well, at this point, you know, they looked at the industrialized nations, the nations with better technology and you know, generally more economic strength. And they said, well, you know, for the most part, you know, these are white nations. Even the United States at the time was seen as a nation descended from white European descent. Well, these areas are doing well. And in a lot of these other areas of the world are maybe not as technologically advanced as us. They said social Darwinism, that's what it was. That you know, through this constant competition between races, that white Western Europeans had kind of risen to a point of dominance. They said it was a white man's burden to go and rule over everybody else that was not as capable, not as intelligent, not as worthy, I guess you could say. Again, it's ridiculous, but it helps to explain a lot. It helps to explain how these countries were getting away with these things, you know, for so many years. Because it's, again, a lot of the racist attitudes, they were widespread. They were overt. Not everybody felt this way, obviously, you know, but a lot of the people in power did, or at least they said they did. To me, I think it's just an excuse to make money, an excuse to exploit people. But it's an excuse that's been used time and time again. And I mean, you'd even see stuff like this in advertisements, in magazines, in newspapers. That's how out there it was. Give you a couple examples. These are some messed up pictures I'm going to show you, but it's just, you got to see them. That way you can hopefully understand just how common this was. Rudyard Kipling, this is actually in your book. He was a British writer. He grew up in India when they were being colonized by India. He's the guy that wrote the Jungle Book, amongst some other, you know, books like Rikki Tikki Tavi and stuff. Now it's debatable whether or not, you know, he was an advocate of imperialism, but you look at some of the things he wrote about, and yeah, there's some messed up stuff there. In fact, the term "white man's burden," if he didn't come up with it, he certainly popularized it through a poem of his. Take up the white man's burden. Send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need. To wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new caught, sullen peoples, half devil, half child. And then here to the right, you see, you know, this older white man, probably like a steamship captain or something. And it's an advertisement for Pear's soap, you know, the white man's burden. You know, we need to take these basic things like soap and cleanliness to these people that wouldn't know anything otherwise. Again, just disgusting. But it's something we can't skip over. The next couple photos are really messed up. You're going to see some very racist caricatures. But again, you know, this helps to show the extent that those in power would go to. I mean, these are things that were in magazines and newspapers to try to build support, justification for doing these terrible things. Here you have, you know, on one side, civilization. And it's the white people, it's the workers, it's the soldiers. This is a British uniform. You have like Lady Liberty here. And you look on the other side and you've got dark-skinned people and it says barbarism. You know, these are people in Africa. These are it could be whoever, but these are people fighting with spears, and you know, they're uncivilized. They don't have our capability. Through warfare, we're bringing progress. We're bringing civilization. Again, that's white man's burden. This next one's really messed up. You look at this picture, and again, caricatures were really big, and a lot of them were really, really racist.
Again, you look at the exaggerated features on all these different people. Native Americans, Latin Americans, Africans, Asians of various descent. They're climbing this hill of civilization. They're trying to get here to the promised land. And they can't do it on their own, at least according to the picture. Good old United States, good old Great Britain, they're going to help them. They're going to help them overcome all this terrible stuff. Barbarism and ignorance and brutality and slavery and cannibalism. And if these people just kind of leave the leading to us, to those of white European descent, they can get there. They might be able to get there. Again, that's white man's burden. Again, terrible, terrible concept. But it was used to justify a lot of things.
We're going to do this one last slide. We still got 5 minutes because this is a good stopping point. So, the racist attitudes are part of it, but that whole idea of the desire to spread Christianity, that's a part of it too. And that goes back to our earlier age of imperialism. Western Europe at this point still predominantly Christian, although there's a lot of forms of Christianity by this point. Same deal with the United States. Oftentimes, as a way of proving that we're not just going in and taking over for greed, we're also trying to do some good things. Missionaries oftentimes, accompany these colonizers. Missionary being just a person who goes to another country to do religious and social work. Missionaries wanted to convert Africans and Asians to Christianity. And they did a lot of really good things. They brought education, they brought better health care, they built hospitals and schools. So you can't say all this is negative, but the native people of these lands never asked for that. And by coming in and maybe not fully forcing their ideas on them, but by highly encourage them, you start to see a lot of those older ways of doing things like ancestor veneration, like animism, kind of start to fall by the wayside. So even though I think you look at missionary work and you say, well, those are some pretty noble goals, the result is you're also destroying native cultures. So those are our motivations. Tomorrow, we're going to go to specific spots. We will first talk about South Asia, mainly India, but also like Pakistan and Bangladesh and places like that. We'll then briefly get into Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, a lot of those places. And then we will get into Africa, which we're probably going to spend the most time on Africa because it's definitely the largest geographic area that kind of got influenced by all of this. We'll work on this tomorrow. We won't have a whole lot of time on Friday, but we are going to do some stuff Friday. And then hopefully we can wrap this whole thing up on Tuesday. If I've got to move some things back next week, hey, it is what it is. It's all good. But I'm hoping we can finish this up on Tuesday. You can either do the SAQ in class or it might have to be for homework. We'll just see. Or maybe we'll do it Wednesday. I don't know. And then we'll start getting ready for the DCA. You guys did a good job. Thank you.